even though Steve Jobs was in California, Steve Wozniak was in California, that's where the garage was, that's where everything was innovated, that's where it all happened, right? Their $5 billion headquarters there, yet somehow their Irish subsidiary or their Netherlands subsidiary,
Right.
they've got all of these things, makes all the money. It is my pleasure to welcome Peter S. Goodman to the show. He is the global economic correspondent for the New York Times and author of a great book that I just finished last week entitled Davos Man, How Billionaires Devoured the World. And he's also the author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy. And Peter comes to us from just outside New York City today. It's great to have him. Peter, welcome. How are you?
Thanks so much, Jason. I'm good. How are you?
Good to have you. And I got to tell you, I was really intrigued by your Davos Man book. It echoed and mirrored a lot of the thoughts I'd been having for years about Davos. I've been following that conference for maybe, I don't know, about 12 years now or even more. And it just always struck me as a lot of hypocrisy. And I mean, I don't know, would you even go as far as saying it's sort of a shadow government? Would that be a fair statement?
I actually don't buy into that popular idea. I mean, there are a lot of conspiracy theories around Davos, like, this is the ultimate place where all the decisions get made. There are a lot of important decisions that get made there because so many powerful people are gathered there. And anytime you have heads of state and regulators meeting with the billionaire class, which always is pursuing deals and, pushing the envelope on permission to do all the things they want to do, you're going to have decisions made. It's not that it's irrelevant. It's that part could be anywhere. The idea that it's some sort of shadow government, run by the supposedly earnest academics in charge, I think that part's nonsense. And it actually does the bidding of the people I call Davos Man. I mean, it's a term I stole from Samuel Huntington, the political scientist who coined it in 2004, referring to the slice of the billionaire class that would have us believe that they will solve all of life's problems, that all of our interests are collective. And so when we buy into this idea of the shadow government, we affirm, all of the well-intentioned pronouncements that the forum makes about climate change and corporate governance and the need to deal with gender and racial injustice. All that stuff is just a facade. I mean, it's a charade. It's a business conference. It's a chance for billionaires to get together and do business.
Yeah, and people really need to become familiar with the term, and I don't even know if you use the term in your book, I can't remember, but rent seeking.
Sure.
That's what Davos, in my opinion, is largely about. It's about the billionaire class engaging in whatever rent-seeking behavior they can get for their companies, for their causes, for whatever it is. And they're doing that at the expense of humanity. Frankly, it's truly staggering. It really is. But first, let's just back up for a moment and give the broad picture, the 30,000-foot view, if you will, and I'll just let you answer it, Peter, because you know best. What is Davos? Just for some people that may not follow it or know, it's the World Economic Forum. It takes place in Davos, Switzerland, which is sort of this kind of unimpressive but beautiful place. But tell us what Davos is, really.
Sure. So Davos, it's this kind of modest ski village that's gotten glitzy over the years because every January, although this year it was in May because the pandemic has messed up the schedule, the World Economic Forum convenes. And the World Economic Forum is this institution started by this German economist, Klaus Schwab, back in the 70s on the proposition that if you got businesses and governments together, you could solve a lot of problems. He's into public-private partnerships. He's into win-win solutions. But along the way, it's become, under the guise of a nonprofit foundation, a highly lucrative enterprise. And Schwab brings in heads of state from around the world to meet with billionaires, public intellectuals, a whole lot of journalists, the odd Hollywood celebrity. There are musicians there. I once had dinner with Peter Gabriel, who was talking about how primates make music. There's always this eclectic mix. There are poets wandering around. But in essence, and this is what I argue in the book, it is the opportunity for the billionaire class to engage in this virtue signaling. And this is the genius of Klaus Schwab's marketing. Simply by being there, you're not at some Forbes or Fortune conference where
or Milken conference
we're here to figure out how to make more money. I mean, this thing convenes under this mantra, committed to improving the state of the world, which is sort of unintentionally hilarious, given that the people who go there, about 3,000 people a year, are by any reasonable measure the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo. And they use their presence in Davos, among other places, to signal, hey, we'll take care of everything. You don't have to regulate us. You don't have to stick us with progressive taxation. You don't have to enforce antitrust. If you just allow us to do our deals and have our conversations about how to solve the big problems of the day, we will take care of that. And all of the benefits will just magically trickle down throughout society, something that has in reality happened 0 times.
Yeah. So where do you want to start as you describe Davos Man? There's so much to cover here. Certainly, the tax avoidance is just really beyond reproach, if you ask me. But there's so much of this rent-seeking behavior just everywhere you look. The environmental hypocrisy is beyond reproach. I mean, listen, I wouldn't have some big complaint about billionaires flying around in private jets if they didn't give me this virtue signaling speech about the environment all the time. It's just like one or the other, folks. I mean, fly your private jet, fine and dandy. That's what billionaires do. That's great. But don't give me a speech of how I need to drive a proletariat car at the same time or be on a New York subway, right? Well, it's just so hypocritical. It's ridiculous. But where do you want to start in describing Davos Man?
Well, my ultimate takeaway for Davos Man is that he is selling us. I mean, first of all, he is like effectively a separate tribe, a separate species even from the rest of humanity, because, his fortune is so complex. I mean, the Davos men, they need to hire accountants and lobbyists and lawyers in scores of jurisdictions around the world. And Huntington used the term, to describe a group that essentially doesn't have any allegiance to any particular nation. They're their own thing. And I think that's important to understand. And I think it's important to understand that they will sell us on this idea that life is this all or nothing proposition, that we either accept that there's inequality like we've got, that we're going to have much of humanity, unable to afford COVID vaccines, to pick one obvious example, or we can monkey around with this successful form of capitalism that's at least got us Google and central air conditioning and jet travel that most people can afford nowadays, or we can mess with that and we could end up being, Venezuela, where we're diving into dumpsters for our dinner. This false binary is at the heart of how Davos Man sells us again and again on this idea that we need more tax cuts and deregulation. He's the good guy. The more money he's got, the more good he can do, especially through his philanthropy, which never pencils out to as much as he would have us believe he gives.
But by the way, I want to just mention something so I don't forget. But have you seen the documentary Poverty Inc.?
I have not.
Fascinating. You must see it. I've told my listeners that before. And it's all about how this philanthropy just backfires because it screws up the economies of these developing countries. And it's just a really fascinating take on the whole thing. I just thought I'd mention that as an aside. But yeah, the philanthropy from the Davos Man is really just window dressing, isn't it?
Well, it's not always window dressing, right? I mean, like Gates, his philanthropy has been quite significant. I spent a lot of time in the book on Marc Benioff, who's a very interesting character, the
Oh,
CEO of
he's such a
Salesforce.
virtue signaling. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well,
Yeah.
so, I'll give Benioff his due. His philanthropy actually is pretty significant. Like, he's organized his company around 1% of all revenues and staff time go to philanthropic efforts. He took out his checkbook to spend $10 million on a ballot initiative that actually increased taxes on tech companies to fund expanded services for homeless people. But
at the same time, what was he doing? Yeah,
at the same time, his company is part of the Business Roundtable, which played the central role in enabling the Trump tax cuts that lavished $1.5 trillion of cuts on people like Marc Benioff. And Salesforce, not coincidentally, has paid the modest sum of zero in federal taxes a couple of times in the last 5 years. So all that other stuff is, to your point about philanthropy, is like a rounding error compared to that. And, I didn't write this book to demonize Benioff or any billionaire. I mean, I'm fine with the fact that there's going to be some inequality in a system governed by capitalism. And capitalism is a terrific way through price discovery to give us innovation and consumer choice and economic growth and, all sorts of things that we should actually hold on to. But we should be so lucky as to have real capitalism. I mean, what we've got is this kind of rugged individualism for regular people where there's no social safety net and various forms of corporate welfare, back to your point about rent seeking, for companies that are able to hire lobbyists the way most of us, have maybe hire somebody to clean our house if we can afford that. It's not that we need to demonize the billionaires. It's that we have to accept that they're going to run their companies catering to shareholders. And if we want to have a say over what sorts of government services are fundable, if we want to have a say over what rules of competition should apply, we're going to have to exercise democracy, our own democratic rights ourselves, instead of outsourcing the jobs to these virtue signaling billionaires.
Yeah. So, gosh, there's so much there. I mean, listen, you won't get any argument from me. I'm a capitalist, but the problem is we don't have capitalism. We have cronyism. I mean, if there is a place where cronyism takes place, it is Davos. That is the place. Right. And then in Washington, D.C., of course, too. But when you look at these billionaires, you look at Bezos and the way Amazon paid no tax a couple of years ago. Right. And there's a strategy, I think, I might get the name wrong, but I think it's called like the double Irish twist that a lot of these big companies employ, where everybody knows that Apple, the company, is in California, right? They built the $5 billion donut-shaped UFO headquarters that is absolutely a phenomenal piece of architecture. That's where Apple is. We all know that. Yet Apple evades California taxes because they don't like the tax jurisdiction of California because it's very high tax, obviously. And then they evade the United States government's taxation by somehow, even though Steve Jobs was in California, Steve Wozniak was in California, that's where the garage was, that's where everything was innovated, that's where it all happened, right? Their $5 billion headquarters there, yet somehow their Irish subsidiary or their Netherlands subsidiary, they've got all of these things, makes all the money.
Well, this is worth picking apart. So first of all, a key argument I make in this book is that none of this happens by accident, right? It's important to understand. It's not that we were, marinated in some perverse belief system such that Congress decided that it would be this wonderful idea to, allow corporate executives to bill all their revenue in some foreign jurisdiction to avoid U.S. taxes without seeing the inside of a federal penitentiary, and did this out of some, holistic faith in the economic dynamism that would flow. This was a fairy tale that was sold by legions of lobbyists working for the largest American corporations. The double Irish goes back to Clinton's administration. We spent a lot of time talking about Reagan as a tax cutter as well. We should. Clinton, was a big fan of corporate lobbying. And he was the one who allowed companies to transfer their intellectual property. So, take Salesforce, for example, because this is how Salesforce managed to pay no taxes. They say, well, all the stuff that's really valuable, the secret sauce of our technology, that lives in Ireland. And then the company in Ireland, our nominal headquarters, is going to charge these very high fees to our American subsidiaries for the use of this intellectual property through a kind of licensing agreement. And guess what? Those fees are going to be so high that the billions of dollars a year that we're earning in real revenue, that just vanishes and gets turned into losses. Imagine if like an Amazon warehouse employee could just say, well, my work boots, they live in the Cayman Islands now, and I'm going to charge a licensing fee to myself to use those work boots every time I go off to work. Therefore, my paycheck, Uncle Sam's going to write me, a fat tax refund, every week with my paycheck because I'm basically earning no money. Well, guess what? That Amazon warehouse worker can't afford to hire 100 lobbyists the way Amazon can. So not by accident, Davos Man's interests are again and again turned into law in the halls of Congress and in countries around the globe.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And since you mentioned Amazon, I mean, the abuses perpetrated by Bezos have been staggering. They really have been. And this whole virtue signaling of all of a sudden he decides a few years back, let's raise the minimum wage of Amazon warehouse workers to $15.
Right.
But what he was really doing is putting his competitors out of business because they couldn't afford to pay that. So a small business, a little retailer, suddenly Bezos switched from where he was suppressing wages and just overworking these people, putting monitors on them like they're machines, the way he would treat people. You take a break to go to the bathroom, you get castigated by your supervisor, right? And then suddenly he's all in favor of lobbying Congress for a $15 minimum wage and raises all of those people to $15 because then he realizes he can just use that as a way to roll over his competition. It's just so ridiculous.
Well, and at the same time that he's opposing any kind of organized labor. I mean, the key
he's trying to destroy unions. I mean,
Right. I mean, I tell the story of Christian Smalls in the book, who's this Staten Island warehouse worker who notices in March of 2020, hey, we're all here on the warehouse floor like it's normal. All the managers are somehow gone. He's told they're at a corporate retreat. Oh, everyone's on vacation. He's seeing the stories about the pandemic on the TV screens in the break room. He gets concerned. He starts asking, what's the deal here? And how come we don't have any protective gear? How come we don't have any face masks? We don't have any hand sanitizer. Bezos releases this letter. Dear Amazonians, we thank you for your sacrifice. We're unable to source. I mean, the everything store somehow can't turn up.
They're the best sourcing company in the world. Yeah.
Right. And of course, Christian Smalls and his colleagues can see, well, they seem to be able to source it when we're putting it in boxes, sending it to people who are paying for it. But there doesn't seem to be any for us because labor, well, we're just a cost to be minimized. Well, Smalls is ultimately fired for violating quarantine, which is really bitterly ironic, given that he wants everyone to be quarantined while they sort out what the risks are for the plant. And they have a plan to actually make it safer for the workers. And he wants paid sick leave for everyone. Amazon has lobbied assiduously over the years against paid sick leave. The U.S. is the only developed democracy on earth that does not have a federal paid sick leave policy. Again, not by accident. Well, Smalls later actually organizes the first labor union, but that goes against the grain. That's a significant victory for the labor movement, precisely because, one of the key traits of understanding Davos Man as a species is he's good with philanthropy. He's good with unilateral shows of generosity. Here's your bonus. Here's my gift to people in a wretched country made slightly less wretched by my largesse, but no collective bargaining. Davos Man's not interested in altering the power dynamic. And so, to your point about Bezos and the minimum wage, he uses Congress to essentially administer a higher wage, which is productive for workers, but he does it as a kind of predatory pricing system against his own competitor to make it harder for companies like Walmart and Target to hire enough workers at a time of worker shortages.
Yeah, it's really something. Okay, give us some more examples of who Davos Man is. Let's learn more about this creature.
Well, let's take Steve Schwarzman, who's a regular at the forum. So he's the world's largest private equity magnate. Depending upon the day, he's worth around $35 billion. He's the master at taking the area in which he's the problem and spinning it that he's the solution to the problem. So after the great financial crisis and the Great Recession, he vacuumed up millions of homes that went into foreclosure around the U.S. He sent his people to courthouse steps and bought homes at auction. A lot of people got moved out of their homes. In his memoir and in public appearances, he'll tell you, this really wasn't about the money. Never mind that he was throwing these bacchanals in celebration for all the bonds he was helping Wall Street sell, backed by these foreclosed homes. I was just doing this to revive communities. We were going into places where lawns were overgrown and swimming pools were full of algae and rodents were running around in the chaos. And we slapped fresh coats of paint on houses and rebuilt electrical systems. And, you can almost hear the soundtrack for a life insurance commercial and imagine a golden retriever puppy romping around with some child on a lawn. I mean, the reality is he starts this subsidiary he calls Invitation Homes, which is an invitation for people to pay much higher rents. He specializes in people who are especially in vulnerable areas where they don't have the money for a security deposit for some new place. They have to pay the higher rents. It's an invitation to sit on hold for hours to get
an invitation to have like a landlord that is basically a slumlord. I mean, these
right.
And now, look, I would not be so critical of this if there were a couple of things, and maybe you can go to this side of the equation too. But when you really look at these things deeply, and I've interviewed the author, I can't think of his name right now, of that sort of seminal article that was written during the Great Recession about Goldman Sachs, the Great Bubble Machine.
Oh, Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, Matt Taibbi, right? Yeah. He's great. I love it.
Vampire Squid.
His book, Hate Inc. is really good, by the way, too. When you realize that these people had a huge part in causing the crisis.
Right.
And creating that opportunity to scoop up the foreclosed homes, right? I would be okay if they weren't the cause and they simply went in there, saw an opportunity and thought, hey, look, we're going to buy these distressed homes. We're going to turn them around. We're going to fix them up and we're going to make the neighborhood better. Right? That'd be okay.
That's the market system. But I mean, they're simultaneously lobbying the Obama administration not to rescue homeowners, right? So there are these massive rescues for too big to fail financial institutions. We're told by Tim Geithner, who now works at a private equity company himself, who was Obama's Treasury Secretary, that we have to think about moral hazard. It would really be wrong.
The only moral hazard is the one you see in the mirror, Tim.
Well, moral hazard is an interesting concept because it implies that, every homeowner who goes underwater after the 2008 financial crisis, pulled out home equity lines of credit to go finance their honeymoon in Tahiti. Certainly, there are plenty of people like that. Sure. We know people like that. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but there are plenty more people who simply came of age where they're raising families in major American cities where there are huge speculators like Steve Schwarzman, who are bidding up the price of real estate, and they're told there's a societal imperative to send their kid to quality schools. To be in a quality school district, they have to pay the freight, and the prices are set by a million other people, some of whom are availing themselves of home equity lines of credit to buy fancy new cars they don't need, many of whom are speculators because the money's so available. And so, families are having to sign here to get themselves in a decent school district. And a lot of those people need to be understood in the context of what is and isn't moral hazard. And along comes the Obama administration, and they say, well, we got money for Goldman Sachs, we got money for AIG. We're not going to prevent bonuses from being paid out to the very bankers who caused the financial crisis, but we're not going to bail out homeowners because somehow that would be morally wrong and bad politics. And then, to your point, the punchline is the very financiers who participated in the speculative orgy that wrecked the housing market now have all this cash to buy up the properties, and they end up profiting, on the other end. Well, just to connect the dots with Steve Schwarzman, in more recent times, Steve Schwarzman and Blackstone have found their way into American healthcare. And this is key to understanding why American healthcare performed so poorly during the pandemic. Schwarzman spent $6.1 billion back in 2018, I believe, to buy up a company called Team Health, which is a company that is one of two giant private equity-owned firms that dominate staffing in emergency rooms. Now, in the same way that Schwarzman understands, if you're going to be a landlord, it's good to be a landlord over people who have no other options. And any casino magnate can tell you, good to make your money in a dark room where people don't know what time it is and they're drinking. If you're going to be in healthcare, good to be in the part where a lot of the customers come in on gurneys, where they're not in the mood to ask about the particularities of their health insurance policies. They just sign the clipboard that's proffered so they can go see the people in the white coats who can relieve them of their pain. Well, Schwarzman's company is at the center of this so-called surprise billing scandal. The surprise is not of the happy variety. It's, you think you are within your health insurance network and you sign away the right to see, you essentially sign off on seeing somebody outside a network, and it turns out you get billed at these extravagant rates, and then bill collectors hound people for months after. This is part of this wave of private equity investment into healthcare that has transformed our healthcare system into something that functions much more like an airline or a fast food chain than what most of us would think about as a place where you're going to get medicine, in the same way that, United Airlines wants every seat filled so they can charge more for the flight. A private equity company that owns a part of a hospital wants all the rooms filled. This is why in the 2 decades before the pandemic, the US loses roughly a third of its hospital rooms. I tell the story in the book of a guy named Ming Lin. He's an emergency room doctor who was working for Blackstone's Team Health, who in March of 2020 at his hospital in Bellingham, Washington, notices that nobody's wearing a mask. There's no triage system. He asks his administrators, hey, what's up with that? He's essentially told, we don't want to freak out the customers coming in for lucrative elective surgeries. He goes to Team Health. He says, why in the middle of a pandemic, when the state of Washington is already under state of emergency, are we letting people come in for elective surgeries? And he's told, oh, well, we work for the hospital. That's our client. Well, he goes public as a whistleblower with the warning that the entire American healthcare system and American society is being put at risk because of the interests of profit for his employer, and he is fired. This underscores that Davos men love to talk about their virtue signaling. They love to talk about, Schwarzman would tell you that Team Health is part of the solution to American healthcare. And yet here we see with this fired whistleblower, the real interests are about profit and everything else takes a back seat, even the worst pandemic in a century.
Yeah, no question about it. And you didn't talk about this in your book that I recall, but Davos Man, I'm sure, is in the privatized prison business as well, where they take people's freedom away for profit.
That's right.
It's just like a hotel or an apartment complex. And listen, I'm a real estate investor. I think this way. You want the lowest vacancy rate possible. But imagine if you could lobby the government to make stricter laws that are these obscure laws that people don't even know they're disobeying. I interviewed the author of 3 felonies a day on my show before, and then you could imprison them and make all kinds of money off of that. It's just disgusting the way these cronies and rent seekers act. It's unbelievable.
Well, it is grotesque, and yet they wrap themselves in the flag They tell us, we're not nanny state loving European socialists. This is real capitalism. And to your point about rent seeking, because I think it's really important, let's just pause and note that business is a source of social good in many instances. Real businesses, if you think about, the average small business, I mean, people have ideas, they employ people, those wages get cycled through our economy. This is the kind of capitalism that needs to be celebrated. The people we're talking about, they essentially figure out how to manipulate our democratic process to produce policies that are often at odds with societal interests, whether we're talking about, how do we deal with mass incarceration in America? How do we deal with climate change? How do we provision for healthcare? They're at odds with our social interests, yet they pervert our process to generate profit opportunities for themselves at social expense. And then when we say, well, maybe we should regulate, maybe we should study, maybe there should be progressive taxation so we can actually finance some of the things people want, they say, oh, no, that's, you might as well be a Trotskyist to propose, radical income redistribution. I mean, Schwartzman once likened simple taxation to Hitler invading Poland. I mean, they are very quick to bat down any attempts at the public using the levers of democracy to have a say over what kind of society we're living in, to, accuse us of being anti-business, anti-capitalist.
No one could be more pro-business than me, right? But this is not business, folks. Right. What goes on at the high levels. It's not, Davos Man is not engaged in business or free markets. Davos Man is engaged in cronyism and fascism. Okay, that's what Davos Man is. And one of the speeches, not really a speech, but like on a panel that I love that took place at Davos, I think you mentioned in your book, was Rutger Bregman, the historian who just lambasted these people. And I also have to mention, I loved Ricky Gervais' comments at, I think it was the Academy Awards a few years ago, when Tim Cook was in the audience and he said, oh, look, you're violating all sorts of things that would be illegal with child labor in the United States, but you just offshore that to China and abuse people there. And everybody worships you here in the US. It's just unbelievable. Yeah, but go ahead.
The Bregman point I think is really interesting. So Rutger Bregman is this Dutch academic who was attending his first Davos. I think it was in 2018, 2019, can't remember. And he breached protocol because the active understanding at Davos. I mean,
I'm surprised you can even obtain that video, frankly, with the censorship on YouTube, and they're all part of the.
They're happy to show it.
Yeah,
it's part of the whole ethos of the forum that it's free flowing. Anyone can say anything, but it was a breach of decorum. I mean, the understanding, if you're at Davos, is we're all very well intentioned. We're all puzzling over how to solve these problems. I've been to, I make this point in the book, I've been to gatherings of pharmaceutical executives discussing, why are drug prices so unaffordable for most people? And they'll really earnestly discuss, well, maybe we haven't come up with the right business model yet. This requires more study. We need more stakeholder dialogue.
Somehow they're less expensive in other countries.
It's never like, well, we've all conspired to make the prices unaffordable because that's good for our shareholders. So here's Bregman, who's on this panel where he's supposed to be talking about universal basic income. And he's asked for his opinion on inequality. And he says,
taxes. Yeah.
I feel like he says taxes, all the rest is bullshit. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use that word.
That's essentially what he said. Yes.
That's exactly what he said.
Is the word bullshit.
And then he says, I feel like I'm at a firefighters conference and I'm not allowed to discuss water. Now, your viewers may remember that because that clip went viral. Yep. I went and rewatched the whole thing. What's fascinating is what happens after. So this panel is moderated by a guy named Edward Felsenthal, who is the editor-in-chief of Time magazine, by then owned by Marc Benioff, one of my 5 key characters, the Salesforce CEO, who is on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum and loves to talk about win-win solutions so that no one has to sacrifice. And Felsenthal turns to Jane Goodall, the naturalist.
Right.
Now think about my Davos man as species.
I watched
metaphor.
the whole panel too. It was about an hour long. Yeah.
And he says to Goodall, he says, what is it about us as a species that, we know how to solve these problems and yet we somehow can't? Yeah. And she, gamely plays along and says something about evolution. I mean, it's an incredible punchline to that because, again, he rebuilds this wall that protects Davos man from ever being held to it. It's not that you're greedy. It's that you haven't settled on the right messaging yet, or we haven't consulted the right stakeholders yet. It's always a process that will eventually yield solutions if we just have more talk.
Yeah, I know they'll be talking for the next 100 years and they'll have the 150th Davos conference and everybody will be poorer and they'll be richer.
Well, by then they'll be in space.
Yeah, right.
It'll be exactly. Like, District 9 or, one of those Matt Damon movies where they're on the comfortable space colony.
Yeah, exactly. It's truly incredible. Well, Peter, just wrap this up for us. Anything I didn't ask you or anything else you want to mention?
Well, what do we do?
Hey, actually, before you do that, wrap up, let me ask you about one thing that puzzles me about the book. You're critical of pretty much every presidential administration in the book. I'm a little bit surprised, and I know he ruffles a lot of feathers, but because Trump in many ways is sort of the anti-Davos man, and he's the anti-globalist. And I'm kind of surprised. And I know, listen, I'm not going to defend Trump, and the shit he says is some of it's very outlandish and immature for sure, no question, right? But I'm kind of surprised you were as critical of him as you were, and maybe it's your New York Times background. I don't know, but
I mean, we don't work for any particular party or any figure. I mean, we go after the fact pattern. Yeah, I am critical of Trump because Trump does offer himself up as the anti-Davos man guy. So does Steve Bannon, who was his leading advisor for the first years as administrator. He loves to talk about, the globalists, and he's all about nationalism and making America great again, all that great stuff. Well, what does Trump actually do for the people he is supposedly championing the interests of? He vacuums up campaign cash from Steve Schwarzman. He delivers the largest package of tax cuts in American history, lavished not on the working people whose interests he's supposed to be serving, but on people like Steve Schwarzman and Jeff Bezos and Marc Benioff. He then engages in this kind of photo op trade policy where he sticks tariffs on China. He's a classic populist, right? He's going to blame the external forces for American problems. So if you distill the Trump message to working people who are quite correct in concluding, and this is why they're happy to embrace this, anti-establishment figure like Trump. They're quite correct in concluding that the elites don't care about them, that for decades, their interests and their ability to support their families doesn't amount to much, if anything, in the halls of Congress. But then he tells them, the source of your problems, it's these immigrants streaming over the borders. We're going to build a wall. It's China. China's trying to steal our lunch. They've devastated us. Now, China is a complex challenge for the global trading system, and China does need to be reckoned with in a sophisticated way. But Trump engages in this completely false narrative that American living standards have been downgraded, and they have, not by the people who actually did it, the Davos men who are financing his campaigns and are delighted recipients of his tax cuts and deregulation. He says, it's China, it's immigrants. Look, our problems are made in Congress, in boardrooms in New York, in Seattle, in companies that have undermined the labor movement. Our problems are domestic. The U.S. is a massive winner in globalization. The U.S. has allowed a handful of billionaires to set up our system, to rig our system so that they get all of the benefits. I mean, I tell the Bezos story in the context of he's ultimately a huge beneficiary of international trade. I mean,
Oh, no question. No.
He's tapped, the factories of China. Where does the money go? It goes into his pocket and the pockets of shareholders. It doesn't get distributed through the workers. So I'm critical of Trump because he's correctly diagnosing a problem that most people know in their bones, which is that, they've been abandoned by the elites, while basically just tap dancing for the very elites who did the job, and handing out goodies to people like Steve Schwarzman and Larry Fink, who we haven't talked about, the world's largest asset manager, and Jeff Bezos.
Gosh, Peter, I could talk to you for hours. I love this conversation. I'm curious, would you be a supporter or would you have been against NAFTA, for example? Same token, China coming into the WTO, yeah.
Look, I think trade is vitally important. I think it's clear that the history of trade going back to the end of the Second World War is when there's more trade, there's less military conflict. Yep. When there's shared dependence upon trade, we're less likely to take up arms.
People don't like to kill their customers.
That's right.
Yeah.
And trade creates export opportunities, and companies that export tend to pay more, they tend to make more, they tend to be more innovative, and they have to compete. And that's all to the good. I think we've allowed our trade policy, again, not by accident, but because of the lobbying of companies, to tilt very much toward the shareholder class and away from the working class. And NAFTA, in retrospect, it was clearly a mistake to not have much tougher rules on working standards, to make it much more difficult for companies to simply avoid American wage scales, American environmental and workplace safety rules.
That's exactly what I've been saying forever about the free trade. Look, I like free trade too. I agree with you in concept. The problem is, there's this old biblical principle about being equally yoked, right? And I think it mostly relates to a marriage, right? But a trade deal is a marriage too. And right. So is any business deal. And the parties have got to be equally yoked. Right. China, Mexico, they're not equally yoked. The US has all the yoke and they don't have any yokes. China can destroy their environment. They can abuse their labor, and the US can't do that. So how are you? Of course, when you have these free trade, you're going to have Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. We
needed to have much tougher conditions in China's WTO accession than we did. And it's important to remember, China's WTO accession was sold to us by Davos Man, by the shareholder class, who told us, by the way, that it wasn't even just about the money. I mean, we heard from people like Clinton and his Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, that oh no, this is about democratizing China. I mean, once we integrate China into the global trading system, we're going to have a growing Chinese middle class, and they're going to demand what every middle class demands, including economic freedoms. Well, that was a sham, because
that didn't happen.
I mean, trade with China changed American business a lot more than it changed Chinese politics.
Couldn't agree more.
And we turned, Google assented to its own censorship. I tell the story in the book of going to see Bill Clinton deliver a talk when he's flown over by Alibaba back in, in the early 2000s, right after Yahoo, which at that point is an Alibaba partner, has given up the IP address for a Chinese journalist who has leaked, a document to a human rights group and has been sentenced to 10 years in prison. This is a guy with a kid. He's sent away. And I tried to ask Bill Clinton, how do you square taking, several $1 million from Alibaba with this Chinese journalist being sentenced to prison? And he sort of pantomimed that he couldn't hear me as he fades into the security cordon. I mean, China's WTO accession was driven by the interests of American shareholders who were using it to weaken the American labor movement, to weaken wage standards, to get out from under various regulations, including workplace safety and environmental, and to lower the costs of production so they could send more money to the shareholders. And the public should have had a say about how that went down. but our political system has essentially been captured by these corporate interests who've used their money. I mean, Davos Man, and I tell the story in the context of Schwarzman very directly, and they've amassed their money and they've used their money to purchase political power, which they've used to protect their money and make their money get that much more voluminous.
I want to put out an invitation. If any Davos man is listening to this or sees this, you're invited on the show. I'd love to come and hear your side of the story, but I have a feeling my invitation won't be accepted. So I'll just throw that out there. Okay, wrap this up for us, Peter. It's been a great conversation and really interesting views on all of this.
Well, the answer to our problems is staring us in the face. It's democracy. And that, it's easier said than done to fix our problems. But what we need to fix, I mean, we're living in a time when our own democratic society is under threat from this inequality. I mean, the breakdown that we're experiencing in faith in institutions, the breakdown in faith that the elites are looking out for the rest of the people. These issues are very real. They're not going to go away until we deal with our economic scarcity. And the way we do that, we don't need some sort of revolution. We don't need some utopian flight of fancy. We need what we already had. We need antitrust enforcement, progressive taxation, and workers' right to bargain for a piece of the action, which is what we had from about the end of the Second World War till the mid-1970s. I don't have a fetish for the 60s and 70s. We don't want to go back to Jim Crow law and the Vietnam War. We made a lot of social progress we want to hang on to, but we need to get back to a time when people can work for a living and support themselves at a middle-class standard. And the solution to that is just not that exotic. We need those three things: progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, and collective bargaining. But that's going to involve mobilizing to take on the entrenched power of Davos Man, because they're not giving up their claim on the political system without a fight.
Yeah, they're not going to. It's interesting. I shared a post about The Simpsons, the fictitious family, right? The Simpsons.
Sure.
And if you look at The Simpsons, you have Bart, who's kind of a loser, obviously, right? He's an idiot. It's one person working. They have a nice suburban house. They have a car. They can support the whole family on that one income. We used to be able to do that in the US.
Right.
And what happened? It's just impossible now. Nobody can do that anymore. And I think squarely Davos Man is to blame for this. It's just a different world. So Peter, thank you for sharing all of this.
Thank you,
do you have a website you want to share?
Sure. PeterSGoodman.com. Or you can find me on Twitter at Peter S. Goodman.
Yeah. And folks, get the book. You'll love it. I highly recommend it. And Peter, really appreciate having you on the show.
Great to talk. Thank you so much, Jason.